Good evening and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960 AM News Talk Radio. Well, I've got a really interesting gentleman for you to meet this evening, and this is Steve Orsini. Steve Orsini is a fascinating individual because, number one, he is the former Secretary of the Cabinet and the head of the Ontario Public Service, Civil Service, and so therefore the most senior civil servant in all of Ontario up until just a short time ago. And then in addition, he's a very nice guy. And so I think that we're going to have an interesting conversation with him tonight. I've had the privilege of interviewing him before when I was interviewing him as chair of Transit Alliance, and he came and spoke very effectively to our Transit Alliance members about some of the challenges in government and the civil service and issues in regards to debt, deficit, infrastructure spending, et cetera. And so I thought it would be really interesting to reach out to him and find out, what it would be like to be in government, not just in a regular day, but in a day when you're part of an emergency. Before I turn things over to Steve and ask him some questions, let me just give you a little bit of his background. He was appointed Secretary of the Cabinet and head of the Ontario Public Service in July of 2014, after 25 years of experience in the Ontario Public Service. From 2011 to 2014, he was Deputy Minister of Finance and Secretary of the Treasury Board. He's also been Deputy Minister of Revenue, as well as Associate Deputy Minister in the Office of Taxation Agencies and Pensions in the Ministry of Finance. He's also been very involved in the Ontario Hospital Association, including Vice President of Policy and Public Affairs. He has a diploma in Public Administration, a Bachelor of Applied Arts in Urban and Regional Planning, and a Master's in Environmental Studies. He's completed the Canadian Securities course and the Harvard University Healthcare Leadership Program. And so therefore, when we're talking about government and a healthcare crisis and finances, there's probably no one better than Steve Orsini to chat with. And so, Steve, maybe I could just start out by saying, what would it be like to be the head of the civil service today? I watch CNN with Donald Trump and some of the people that have to stand up and behind him that are civil servants and politicians, and then also similarly Premier Doug Ford and some of the people that have to stand up behind him. That's got to be a pretty tough job, both getting ready for those briefings as well as participating in those briefings.
So Brian, well, thank you for inviting me on your show, and it's a pleasure to be here. And you're absolutely right. On a normal day, you're working day and night. I used to say I had a 9-to-5 job, but that was only on weekends. I can see right now that the entire public service, including the current Secretary of Cabinet, Stephen Davidson, are just working around the clock constantly. And they have to not only monitor what's going on, which, as you know, is rapidly changing right around the world, and keeping tabs on how this pandemic is unfolding in countries that are slightly ahead of us, and also to think of all the ways that this pandemic would impact people, our systems, our economy. And so they're meeting frequently. There's an emergency management team that's providing ongoing advice. Each ministry with its deputy minister will have their own emergency management team. They're all responsible for different parts of the economy or society at large. So it's a constant exchange of information, projecting what could happen, and then implementing plans to deal with it.
Tell me, as a citizen, should we have confidence that our civil service are bringing the right facts to the political leaders?
I think what I've seen is very little daylight between what public health officials are saying and what the government's doing. That's a good sign. If you just look south of the border, you'll see a lot of daylight.
A lot of daylight.
And it's really important because you hear this at the federal level and at the provincial level. They're listening to the experts. No one's really gone through this before. It's not as if there's a exact roadmap of how to proceed. So they're listening to the experts. And when they say you have to have physical distancing, or we need to shut down operations, the governments at all levels are responding quickly. To me, that's a sign that people understand how serious this is. People understand they have to take it seriously and they have to take action. And so that, to me, is a sign of good organization, competence, and reacting when they have to. And I think, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I think, not only you're looking to the future, but you have to look at the past and say, okay, have what we've done impacted the way we expected? So you roll out your plans, and then you got to monitor how effective it's been.
Yeah.
And then you got to constantly change. So it's a lot of information gathering. It's a lot of digesting of that information. It's seeking direction from decision makers and experts. And then it's rolling out plans one after another. You can see both levels of government, and as well as municipalities, constantly rolling out new strategies, new actions, because they're trying to keep ahead of where we are in this pandemic.
But all of a sudden, there's got to be a public servant that is, I'm not sure what, the head of infectious control or something like this, that, was someone you didn't speak to or talk to for months, if not years on end, that all of a sudden is the most important individual in the room. That's got to be a strange situation for a principal secretary or a premier to be in.
I think we do have a structure, the Provincial Emergency Operations Committee, and they have a series of committees with experts on it, working with other levels of government, working with our partners in the communities, whether municipalities, healthcare providers. So that's in place and always operating. What you see now, visibly, and what you're hearing are the public health experts speaking, because it's their advice that the government's taking in. As a secretary of cabinet, I would want to make sure I hear directly from them and have constant input from them, as well as emergency management committee, because they're the ones that are on the ground monitoring what's going on, giving advice on what needs to be done to contain this, and then also rolling out strategies in terms of how do we have sufficient medical equipment? Do we have enough capacity? Where in the province is it a bigger problem than elsewhere? How do we allocate resources? That's a dynamic, fluid,
there's so much information that you and or whoever the individual in the room is that's sort of receiving the information has to receive from so many different people. And just as a study of leadership, I think it's been fascinating the last couple of days, if not a week or two. And I am a business guy. I do try to study leaders. I think Governor Andrew Cuomo, for an example, comes in front of the cameras with his daily press release. He's got PowerPoint slides that detail what he's talking about. He appears to, number one, have listened to the experts, and he's got an incredible amount of detailed knowledge about what's going on. And then you see him out touring the convention center that's going to be turned into an emergency hospital, for an example. And so he just exudes an incredible amount of detailed knowledge, confidence, and frankness and honesty. And you don't see that. You see some of that in other people. You don't see that in other people. Tell me what your experience has been in either the civil servant and or the leader. And let's talk about the head of infectious control. I think his name is Tony Fauci in the United States, who similarly he just exudes honesty, frankness, and depth of knowledge. But other people don't. And so, in your study of people, you've worked for dozens, if not hundreds, of different both civil service leaders as well as political leaders. What's it like in an emergency? And how do you become this one type of a leader rather than the other kind of a leader?
It's a very important question. And I think the key to it is being evidence-based. People can guess what's going on. People can project or forecast what's happening, but it's those that can provide minute by minute evidence of what is happening right now become extremely valuable. You don't want them to say, well, I think this is really bad or this is not too bad. Again, not to point fingers south of the border, but you can't keep telling people, don't worry, it's going to be over. you have to give people the facts. And the public's a lot smarter than most people would. They understand information and they understand how it comes across. If it's genuine, if it's fact-based, and they're not trying to um, uh, hide things that they think that the public will react to. You have to be upfront, honest, and real time. And that's why you see a lot of frequent news conferences.
Yeah.
That silence is not healthy. People need to know. They're very well educated. The public understands, and they need to be reminded about physical distancing. It's hard when you've been working from home and you go out and you connect with people. You need to remind them, and that's what you're seeing. You're seeing leaders stepping up and saying, look, we have to ensure that people keep a safe physical distance. It'd be easy to say, don't worry about it. But what you're hearing is a genuine concern, and the seriousness of this pandemic means that you're hearing frequent statements over and over again, because changing human behavior isn't instant. You got to remind people before it becomes habitual.
No question.
And that's where I think right now it's evidence, is people giving the facts, because that's what people need to make decisions, is the evidence.
We're chatting with Steve Orsini, the former head of the public service in Ontario, and one of the smartest gentlemen I've had the privilege of meeting over the course of the last couple of years. We're going to take a quick break for some messages and come back more with Steve in just a minute. Stay with us. Well, welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960 AM News Talk Radio. We're chatting this evening with Steve Orsini. He's now retired from the Ontario Public Service and is a professor at the Monk School of Government at U of T. But I wanted to chat with him, not because of his professorship. Well, maybe we should actually ask you what it's like being a professor now, but to see what it would be like to be him, a year or two ago, if this had happened under his watch, and what would he have done. Steve, maybe, I see these people, whether they're Ontario or Canada or in the United States or New York State, there all the time. Tell me, what's the daily life of someone like yourself in an emergency, in a pandemic like this? You say that they're working 24/7. Have they moved cots into their offices? Like, what's the day in and day out reality of their existence? If you were the head of the public service, or if you were Premier of Ontario, or if you were the head of infectious control for the province of Ontario, what's your life?
Well, it's constant communications. Not only does emergency management, which plays a vital role during emergencies such as what we have today, but they have to keep on top of what's happening in the communities, the number of cases, the number of deaths, where it's spreading, whether they can trace, and this is really important, whether they can trace the cause and effect. That's why you're hearing a bit more of alarms about community transmission, where they're not clear how that person was infected.
Okay, so let me interrupt you for a second. In Ottawa, the Ottawa Citizen on Sunday, there was an article and a quote from the head of infectious control for the city of Ottawa that said there were 49 confirmed cases in Ottawa, as reported. But he thought there were actually 4,000 people with the virus in Ottawa. And he said for two reasons. Number one, because the 49 was a couple days old, because the 49 was people that had been tested and had got the results, and it takes a couple of days to get the results. And then he said, second of all, was because there's a whole bunch of people that have been infected that either have symptoms and haven't bothered to go get tested, or are asymptomatic and they're out in the community and spreading it around. And he went through some statistics that I found astounding. He says that on average, every person transfers the infection to 2.6 people, and that in 10 generations of transmission without social distancing, and that takes 5 or 6 days, that one person transmitting to 2.6 people times 10 transmissions is 3,500 people. And so based on those two analyses, he predicted there were 4,000 people in Ottawa that, as of last Sunday, had the infection. And so, this is the head of infectious control that's saying, don't believe the 49, and it's not 10 times worse it's 100 times more impactful. With those kinds of potential changes, I'm not sure whether it's right or wrong, but just in a sort of a standard deviation of what the error of his statement might be, the number of people infected in Ontario would be dramatically more than we're currently looking at.
So I think that would be why the public health officials want to make sure they know exactly how it was transmitted or how it's spreading through a community. So back to what you're saying, they need the evidence and information, and they need to trace and find out all those human contacts. That's why isolating 14 days after travel or any type of exposure is critical, because they're still trying to understand it. From what I understand, the science around this is still evolving. And so you need to be very prudent of creating that distance. So back to the day-to-day, it's constant monitoring of where these episodes happen, who's impacted, what was their travel plans, and who have they been interacting with to get at that issue.
And who's doing that? That's the public health organizations around the country.
It's a hierarchy controlled by the obviously the Ministry of Health is playing a leadership role. They're having primary responsibility, but the overall emergency preparedness is a group of professionals that have a whole network of people right down to the local health officers in communities, connections with hospitals. So someone presents themselves and they're tested and it's confirmed, or they're presumptive. We're not sure yet, but we got to take precautions and isolate them. This is where very detailed, rigorous monitoring comes in. And as decision makers, as leaders of the government or of a ministry, you're getting constant information. And many people need to work from home because that's a way to stop the spread, even in the workplace.
Yep.
That telecommunications is becoming more crucial, not less. So you're constantly on the phone, you're constantly on video conferencing, you're getting information, emails, giving you statistics. You're thinking through, how is this going to impact? Every ministry is looking at their emergency preparedness plan and coming forward and say, well, we need to think about how this is going to impact health and safety in the workplace. How is this going to impact WSIB? How is it going to impact healthcare provision? Where are the bottleneck in the supply chain? All those issues will be coming to a central table to one, identify and then develop responses. So it's a very dynamic, fast moving, and the information is constant. It's not as if you can, or 2 minutes, or even hours. It's constant and it's fast and dynamic.
So let's talk about some of the sort of the personal realities again, if we could. So if you were in that role today, are you speaking to a counterpart in the federal government on a regular basis? And if so, how often?
There are, one of the things about emergency preparedness is they've already mapped all this out. If there's an emergency, who speaks to whom? And so that's all determined in advance. You want the experts talking to experts. The Prime Minister will have a teleconference with the premiers. The premiers would be having discussions with their own cabinet. Ministers will be having discussions with their own ministry staff, and a number of different cabinet committees would be meeting. There's an emergency cabinet committee I would imagine meeting on a regular basis. All these structures are in place so that you don't have to create the process. Now there's some tweaks and changes that you might need to it to deal with the type of emergency. If it's flooding, it's a different type of emergency.
Yeah.
But given the nature of this pandemic, it's invoking every single function within government to look at how is it impacting people, businesses and the economy.
Now, it seems, and this may or may not be fair, and you said we won't point fingers at the United States, but let's just, from a comparison purpose, consider it for a second. It seems to me, just watching the news, that Canada and the Canadian provinces seem to be working more closely together. Ontario and Quebec make similar announcements on the exact same day, for an example, that may not be applicable for the rest of the country, but seem to be coordinated. And yet in the United States, you see that it's almost as if the states are negotiating to get more things from Washington. And it's New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut that are working more closely together than New York and the federal government. Do we have a very different interaction between the federal and the next level of government in Canada than they do in the United States?
We saw, and I personally experienced this back in 2008 and 2009 when we were going through a financial meltdown. And the level of collaboration, and Minister Rod Phillips said this the other day, that the level of collaboration now is extremely high, that you'll see provinces and the federal government working hand in hand to tackle this extraordinary pandemic we're faced with. In the US, you're seeing leadership coming from the governors.
Yeah.
And so it's impressive, as you mentioned earlier, some of the governors are really playing a leadership role. We're fortunate in Canada that, yes, there's federal provincial bickering from time to time, but when it matters most to the public and to the safety of the public, they put their bickering aside and they've done some extraordinary things together.
Why is that, do you think? Are we just nicer Canadians, or do we have a different structure? Are we less partisan? Is it because it's not an election year like it is in the United States? What is that?
There could be a number of reasons. I think as a small country in the scheme of things globally, we need to work together to achieve major goals. Like the whole Team Canada years ago was the federal government and the provinces working together to enter new markets around the world. As a smaller player in the big leagues, we have to collaborate to be much more effective. That's part of it. It's a bit of the Canadian psychic to be.
So we have to.
So we have to. For our economic prosperity, we do have to work together. You see this on major projects such as transit, as you opened up with. So I think Canada is different from that regard. When you're the biggest person in the block, you tend to take for granted the need for collaboration. But this is going to highlight, I think, more than ever before, that to solve global problems, we're going to need global collaboration.
No question.
You got climate change, you got global income inequality, you got now this pandemic, and you're going to see more and more countries are going to have to work together to solve them. There's no borders for a coronavirus. There's no borders for climate change. And that's going to put more pressure, I think, on the US to play ball with other countries around the world. Canada can be a leader. And I feel Canada has in the past been able to step up and play a role internationally to bring countries together. Yeah. And I think that's our nature. We tend to do that, especially during times of difficulty.
Now, you may not have experience with this because I think most of your experience has been provincial, but I think we've had a G7 call between the leaders of the G7 and we've had a G20 call between the leaders of the G20. Do you think those were actually good meetings / calls, or were they just sort of because it was something the press demanded and they needed to do it? And what would it have been like to have been part of those calls?
Well, I was in the Ministry of Finance back to 2008-9. Those calls were extremely important.
Really?
Because as you can see, without a concerted effort, it was the time back then was contagion. Remember the subprime asset-backed securities and the contagion within the financial services sector. Banks had money invested in another bank in another jurisdiction. And the idea was you needed a global response to keep it from spreading. And we're now in a medical situation where we need a global response to keep this from spreading quickly. And there's concern because countries aren't moving fast enough. There's concern that there could be a new epicenter, like a new hotspot in the globe where this starts to spread faster and faster. There's a concern of the US.
Seems like we've got it, New York City.
We have that in certain parts of the US. We saw that in Italy, although they responded quickly. And I think that's what a good measurement of competency and effectiveness is how fast, once it's been identified, how fast do the system respond to dealing with it?
Right.
If it's getting out of hand, you gotta move swiftly, because this thing, as you pointed out, the compounding, the multiplying, it grows exponentially.
Yeah.
And that's why you have to, the sooner you act, the shorter time it will take to tackle this huge problem.
We're chatting with Steve Orsini, who is the former head of the public service in Ontario, the former principal secretary to the cabinet, so the most senior public servant in Ontario up until very recently, about what it's like to be in that kind of leadership position during a crisis. And we're going to take a short break and come back with more with Steve in just a minute. Stay with us. Well, good evening. We're back with Steve Orsini, the former head of the civil service in Ontario, former principal secretary to the cabinet, so the most important civil servant in all of Ontario. He's got an illustrious 25-year career, both with the hospital sector as well as different departments in Ontario, Queen's Park, and ultimately got the top job. And so he must have done the job right for a long period of time. Steve, I wonder if I can ask you about a couple of things that, I've been intrigued by, and probably other people are, and you probably have an opinion on. It seems like the Prime Minister of Canada is really resistant to enacting the Emergency Act, which I think used to be called the War Measures Act. And I think someone pointed out that the very last time it was ever enacted in Canada was his father enacting it during the FLQ crisis. And why is he, do you think, resistant to using that? Is it because it's sort of the ultimate tool, and you don't want to do it until it's absolutely necessary? And frankly, given the numbers, why isn't it absolutely necessary now?
Well, I would say they're probably going through the whole options, considerations, pros and cons. I would just, not knowing exactly what those conversations are, if I was thinking through the pros and cons, the question you would ask is, it's still always on the table. So it's there if you need it. That's the first point. The second point is, can you do everything you need to do without it? Are there any powers that the federal government doesn't have that would give them? There was an extraordinary agreement in the House of Commons to agree on the COVID-19 action plan. There was a bit of toing and froing on the exact powers, but it seems that their agreement was reached, and significant support is now being rolled out from the federal government to help people impacted by this. So the question, and I don't know the answer to, are there anything that emergency action would give them that they don't have now? And so I can't answer that. But that would be, if they find that they can't do what they need to do, then that is an option that they'll need to consider and exercise it carefully.
So, we've heard a lot in the press of some of the different states in the United States competing against each other to bid for masks and ventilators or respirators and things like that. We haven't heard that in Canada at all. Is there a different system for procurement and where scarce assets need to be sent in Canada?
Yes, and I have some familiarity with that now, is that there's the federal government's taking the lead in procurement. What you don't want is every hospital and every municipality in every province going to the same people to procure essential medical equipment. So you'll see buy from Canadians. So the federal government and the province of Ontario have moved quickly to see if business can convert their existing operations. You need a coordinated event. Ontario did something very innovative. They created Ontario Together, where business can log into a portal and identify what they can provide. And so that portal now gives the people procuring a sense as, okay, this will be available at this time. You need a centralized procurement because you might need to reallocate. If there's if the virus spreads unexpectedly more in one part of the country or one part of the province, you'll need the ability to reallocate. And so that's the issue. My understanding is the head of procurement for federally is actively involved. Ontario's Ministry of Health is actively involved, and we need that coordination. There's a lot of back and forth behind the scenes, for sure, but it's being as best we can coordinate it because, again, Canada might be a small purchaser, like relative to the US or even California or New York State. So the better we can coordinate our purchase, the more efficient it is to procuring these types of essential medical equipment. That personal protective equipment is critical to keep our frontline staff, who are doing a great job, and we are very appreciative of everything they're doing. We got to keep them safe. And having a coordinated procurement system is essential to keeping our frontline workers safe.
And it seems like we've got that coordination far more effective in Canada than it appears in the United States, where you got this competition between states, and the governors have been on TV admitting that. I had a guy that I interviewed yesterday from Africa, and he was saying the problem is there's no coordination internationally. And what's going to end up happening is Africa is just now getting the infection, and the rates of infection in Africa are skyrocketing. And the healthcare system there, he says, is generations behind where it is now in the West. And if the infection takes off like we expect it to, like they expect it to, and we've now used up and contracted for all of the scarce equipment, what's going to be left for the third world?
So it's a very important question, which is back to the point we talked earlier. We need a global response to these global pandemics. And I think it's important to ramp up our production as quickly as we can. If China's at the point now where they have more or less controlled the spread, and they've been ramping up production of their medical equipment, it may now be available to export. Countries that are ramping up, and we're doing that in Canada, I'm sure they're doing in the US, we need to ramp up not only for our own needs, because not every country can manufacture these vital pieces of equipment. So we need to think about not only meeting our needs, but meeting a global need. That's where the World Health Organization will need to be helpful to say, we think we need this globally, and work with their counterparts in the major countries that have manufacturing bases that can start to produce this. Yeah. So that's where I think coming out of this, we're going to really step back and say, did we have the right global network in place
to address
that was strong enough to deal with such a pandemic? And I think as much as we are coordinating now, it may prove to be necessary but not sufficient when we do a retrospective on this. But right now, we need to do a full court press on monitoring, surveilling, isolating, and producing vital medical equipment, not only for our frontline workers, but the public at large.
Tell me how you, in that kind of a role that you used to be in, can make a decision in regards to different regions of either Ontario or Canada. It would appear that dense urban environments, Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, Mississauga, have the infection, and it's being spread via the community. But there's provinces in Canada that are very, very low in the infection. And there's parts of Ontario, the north, as an example, that are very, very low in infection. And yet you're applying, the provincial government, the national government are applying similar kinds of physical distancing rules, stay-at-home rules, closure of non-essential business rules across the board. And so harming the economy in Parry Sound and in Alliston and in North Bay as much as in downtown Toronto. Is that fair?
I would rely on the public health experts. If they're concerned that someone may be infected but not showing symptoms, and you don't know where that person is in the province or the country or the world for that matter. And so sometimes you have to take actions to prevent. It's all about risk management. We can't say for certain that they're not, we're now seeing it in the territories. We're seeing cases now in the Yukon, the Northwest Territory, that wasn't there a week ago. And so you can't, this is such a viral type of pandemic, which you can't predict exactly where it's going to pop up. So it's being very prudent to apply these rules right across the board.
Okay, but then
we don't know exactly who has it. Your example earlier, where it could be in the community that we haven't even identified yet.
And I agree with you, but I'm just trying to explore the argument here. You got President Donald Trump who's saying that Texas has hardly been infected at all, and so therefore, why are the same rules being applied to Texas that are being applied to New York City? And obviously, New York City is now the hot spot. And I think that there's a lot of people in Texas that probably have some sympathy for that argument. And so therefore, how do you take into account regional disparities in the impact of the pandemic?
I think you deal with that on the fiscal side, the government support side. I would be very careful not to try to deal with that on the medical side. We don't know that how far it's penetrated into the community. And maybe there's a few people in Texas now that aren't exhibiting symptoms. Doesn't mean it's not in the community. And I think it's at being prudent, because once it's in the community and then that exponential growth, it's very hard to contain. And we see there's a lag. We saw it first break out in China, and then country after country, we started to see cases, and then we see exponential growth. And so I think it's very wise to listen to the public health expert to say, you may not think it's in your community, but you can't guarantee it's not there, and you better need to take action to prevent it from spreading.
Well, and I heard it explained, I think excellently, by a doctor that I spoke with yesterday, who said, the time you got to start exercising because you're worried about a heart attack is before you get the heart attack. If you wait till you exercise and diet and eat right until you get the heart attack, then you waited too late. And it's the same thing here, is that you see the people that, the places that take action when they know they need to take action, it's probably too late to take the action. You still got to take it, but it's too late to stem the tide. Really what we got to be doing is taking the action ahead of time. And that's probably a lot of the criticism that has been put on different politicians and governments' shoulders, that we saw it in China, and maybe we should have acted more quickly before it really had a chance to hold. I was in New York and Boston 3 weeks ago, and I arrived back 3 weeks ago today. I arrived back 4 days before things closed down. 4 days. If I had arrived back 4 days later, people's attitude toward me would have changed dramatically, and the rules for my arrival would have been dramatically different. And that just shows you the difference between 4 days.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. I was reflecting back when Mel Lastman called in the Army when we had that giant snowfall. You will recall that.
Yep.
And he was criticized. And I remember at that time walking down the street and seeing that there's only room for one car. And if an ambulance had pulled up, it would have added 10 minutes to them trying to back up and get out of it. And so we sometimes accuse politicians who are brave enough to make those decisions in the public interest. And I think government should get the kudos. The Premier of Ontario who's really stepped up to the plate, the prime minister, and then working in collaboration, and you don't see the partisanship. And I think that to me is a really healthy sign that the science and the public health expertise and the political leaders, there's very little daylight between them.
You know,
And I think that is a sign that now, could we do it faster? Could we move? That's where the review after the fact, we'll learn from this. And there will be a lot of learnings from this. But right now, we want little daylight between the experts and government action.
So you raised the Premier of Ontario, and actually, I got to be honest, I've been frankly impressed, and I previously wasn't overly impressed with the Premier, and his almost denial of the science of climate change had me worried. But he seems to have really stepped up to the plate and accepted the science, maybe because the science is unquestionable and is going to have an immediate impact rather than maybe an impact 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 years from now. But he's done a very good job in this emergency.
I've seen the level of leadership at the political level and the public service level. I know, having spoken to a number of them, that they're working around the clock. They care. The Premier cares, from what I've been hearing. He wants to do the right thing, and the partisanship has been put aside. And again, whether you heard this in the House, whether it's the blue party, the red party, the orange party, or the green party, there's just one team Ontario. That's an important message.
We're all in this together.
We're all in this together because we are. The fact that we have to keep physical distance from people we know and our social lives means that all of us have a stake in the game, and that we could change, of course, we can change destiny. If someone doesn't behave appropriately, they're putting their community at risk. And I think we need to thank the frontline workers, the public servants, our political leaders, small business, everyone that's out there doing what they can to contain this. As hard and as difficult as it is, and as frustrating as it may be, they're actually doing the right thing, and they should be acknowledged and congratulated for it.
Well, I agree with you completely, and our thanks go out to all of them. I don't agree with this question, but let me ask you it to see what your response is. I've heard some public health people say they think between 40 and 70% of the population are going to get infected by this virus ultimately. And so therefore, by flattening the curve, flattening the curve that Tony Fauci and other people talk about all the time, all we're doing is delaying the time period of when we're going to get infected, or when the majority of the population are getting infected, and we're harming the economy for a longer period of time. How do you, as a government leader, play sort of that, if everyone's going to get infected anyway, why it makes sense to flatten the curve rather than let people get infected? And, I've heard this with young people that say, look, the chance of me getting infected is low, or the chance of me getting infected is high, but the chance of me dying from it is very, very low. So why don't I just get infected early and become immune and then get back to work?
Well, there's a number of reasons why that would be ill-advised. The obvious one is they could be a carrier and their grandparents could suffer from it.
Right.
It could be that the healthcare system is overwhelmed. And in Italy, you hear them saying they're making life and death decisions. Who gets a ventilator and who does not?
Yeah.
The system capacity can't handle that. And we don't know. We might think that we're young enough and our immunity system strong enough that it may not have serious implications. But a lot of people are on ventilators that didn't expect to be on ventilators. And so, and ultimately, if we find a vaccine and we can reduce the impact on people's well-being, now that's a long way off, but we're racing against time. And the more that we delay this, the better the system will be in terms of protecting the most vulnerable, not overloading the healthcare system and putting our healthcare workers at risk. And the sooner we might have something that will help minimize or a vaccine that might allow people to be exposed to it and not contract it. So I think there's a number of reasons, but if you allow it rampant, we haven't seen the end of this, and we think the economy is going to be better if we don't tighten up as much, but it might be just a more deeper, longer term impact on the economy because it's just growing exponentially. And the last point I'll make is that you're making a judgment on people's lives. Yeah. And that's a calculation that I don't think is fair for people to make if we say that more people will die, but the economy will be better. That's a moral decision, and it's one that I think people can't take lightly.
I agree with that. Governor Cuomo answered a similar question by saying, you just can't put a price on someone's life. And you know what the right thing is to do, and that's what Dad taught us. And so I agree with that conclusion completely. We've faced this before. You talked about the 2008-2009 crisis. We also had SARS in 2003. Have we learned lessons from those prior experiences?
I think our response for a pandemic is much better because of the experience with SARS. We've learned a lot from that. I think that's why part of our system is in place. Ministries have emergency management plans. The whole emergency management system has been strengthened because of this. Is it perfect? We'll find out later whether or not there's lessons learned. But I think because of that, we're much wiser. And I think because of this, it's going to make us as a global community much more resilient in the future. And the key is, can we take the appropriate action now? So yes, the answer is yes. The other question that's related to your initial question is, in 2008, 2009, after the financial meltdown, the question was, how are we going to rebuild our economy? How are we going to get people back into jobs? So as much as we're trying to contain the pandemic now, we're going to have to start to think about, how do we build in a recovery? Back then, the government was building in bold initiatives to deal with the financial calamity. Yeah. Back then. So huge infrastructure projects. This is going to be different. How we rebuild the economy? How do we get people back to work? And the nature of work could change. Telecommuting might be more natural as a result. So we're going to need to start thinking about, how are we going to build up our economy and society in the future following from this? And so people will be, right now it's crisis mode, all hands on deck, but we're going to need to start thinking about, how do we build in a recovery plan? How do we ensure that it's not a big U downturn, that it's more of a V, it's a quick bounce back? That's still to be written. We don't know what that will be.
I spoke with a money manager earlier this week, a very successful money manager who regrettably thought it was going to be an L-shaped recovery. So even a U would be positive by his terms, because he was predicting thousands of bankruptcies of small and medium-sized businesses that couldn't afford the layoffs, couldn't afford the employees, had troubles getting restarted, didn't have several months of cash lying around in their bank account to withstand such a situation. And I think that the economy could be pretty troubled for a while. And so I think smart people like you are probably, at the same time as the Ministry of Health, they're working long hours, at the Ministry of Finance are working long hours on trying to figure out how we get things moving again.
Well, one of the things I've noticed a change is, before, a lot of these support programs were application-based. I presume the federal government had no choice to have an application base for employment insurance. They have 1 million, they expect 4 million, if I got the numbers right, of people applying. Ontario's done it where you don't have to apply. They've done it through a number of mechanisms. And I think if we can look at ways to provide that relief, that you don't have to apply. It's automatic. It's a better way of dealing with the crisis now. So deferring, taxes, WSIB, corporate income tax, the federal government announced, those deferrals will help. The question will be, but no, are we going to regain that lost income? And that's going to put a pressure in the future when these big deferrals come to an end. So we're not done yet.
Yeah.
And I think government's going to have to think carefully about, is that a deferral or a forgiveness? And deferring right now is fast and simple, and it's an effective way to go. But relief will have to be relief, because I agree with the concern that once these big walls of deferrals end, people are going to be struggling. Say, I didn't work for 2 months.
Yeah.
And now I got to pay for all the taxes I was supposed to pay for the last 2 months. And so I think we're not done yet in terms of the level of support. And I don't think the government thinks they're done yet either.
It's going to have to be huge. One last question. You talked about emergency preparedness, and you may not know, but just give me a sense if you could. We've seen pictures in Madrid of convention centers being turned into hospitals. In New York, convention centers being turned into hospitals. In Madrid, arenas being turned into morgues, and refrigeration trucks being pulled up to hospitals in New York. If things go bad, are there people in Queen's Park that are thinking about things like that, about extra hospitals and extra morgues and extra ventilators and stuff like that?
I think they've been thinking about that right from day one. When I think it broke out in China, I would imagine they're doing their forecasting, their scenario planning, and say how we're going to accommodate this. That's why yesterday the Minister Rod Phillips announced over $500 million in money to hospitals. In other words, we got to build up that capacity.
Right
exactly
away.
Where that capacity will occur, I haven't heard of hockey arenas or convention centers, but there's enough healthcare leadership, they'll figure it out.
Right.
But they need the resources and they need the staffing, which will become a challenge as well if people are infected and they can't work. That's why we're back to that personal protective equipment
being so important.
We vitally need, because we have to keep our frontline staff capable of providing the services that they've dedicated their life towards.
Well, I got to tell everyone, I've had the privilege of speaking with you and interviewing you a few times now, Steve Orsini, former head of the Civil Service in Ontario and former Principal Secretary to the Cabinet in Ontario. And I think you are a great example of the type of civil servants that we are proud that are running our province. And we've seen some of them on TV, both in Canada, Ontario, and the United States in the last little while. And sometimes civil servants get a bad rap. It's times like this in an emergency where we see how effective, how smart, how capable, how honest you are. And so maybe on behalf of all the civil servants you used to work with, you could take my thanks for the work that you all do and in helping us get through our tough times and hopefully bringing good times back again. So thank you, Steve, for coming on today, and thank you for all the work that you have done, and thank you to all of your peers.
Thank you. And it's my honor to be here, and I'm thrilled and proud of the team that are there now working on behalf of Ontarians. So thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Good night. That's the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960 AM tonight. Join us every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock for interesting conversations with fascinating people. Good night.